1 second, inshallah, we'll begin. Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So this is lesson 12 in our classes on Mukhtasar al-Quduri. And we are going to be completing the description of prayer in this specific lesson. And so in the last lesson, I believe we left off, where did we leave off? We had started the section on the descriptions, the complete description of prayer from Imam al-Quduri's Mukhtasar. And we only took the first in the book. And so now we're going to be taking the rest of this particular section. And so we'll just dive straight in to the book. Imam al-Quduri begins by saying ثم يقرأ فاتحة الكتاب وسورة معها وثلاث آيات من أي سورة شاء. Then he recites the Fatiha and a surah with it, or 3 verses from any surah that he wishes. And of course we took earlier when we were looking at the integrals of prayer that the recitation of the Fatiha and the recitation of a surah is considered necessary but not obligatory. And we detailed why the Fatiha was not deemed an obligatory act by the Hanafi ulama. And we also took the epistemology that underpinned the Hanafi conclusion in that regard. But nonetheless, because we know that reciting the Fatiha and reciting a surah was the continuous practice of the Prophet ﷺ in prayers, especially in specific cycles of the prayer, and because we have very emphatic hadith from the Prophet ﷺ regarding the Fatiha to the prayer and it's being presented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in its most complete and perfected of forms. This is why the Hanafi said that the Fatiha and a surah, reciting them in the prayer is considered obligatory. And we mentioned that it is also, it is wajib or necessary, not obligatory. And we also mentioned that tartib between the two is also necessary or wajib, meaning that you have to recite the Fatiha first and then the surah after it. You cannot change the order. That would violate the wujub. And we also mentioned that it needs to be specified within the first 2 cycles of an obligatory prayer and all cycles of the nawafil prayer. And so these were all taken in the previous lesson. Just to have details regarding that, can look at lesson 11. Then he says, when the Imam says, وَلَضَالِّينَ قَالَ آمين, that when the Imam says, وَلَضَالِّينَ, he says Ameen, and the follower says this also, and they both say it silently, right? وَيُخْفُونَهَا, they both say it silently. And again, some of these rulings we're going to be going through very quickly because they can be explained in a straightforward manner, and others will dive into a little more deeper. And so when it comes to this particular issue, there are explicit hadith in this regard that the Prophet ﷺ said he instructed his companions that when the Imam says غير المغضوب آمين, that when the Imam says these specific words, then say Ameen. فإنه من وافق قوله قول الملائكة غفر له ما تقدم من ذنبه. That because whoever's saying of Ameen corresponds with the statement of the Malaika, they're saying Ameen as well, then his previous sins will be forgiven. Is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or the Prophet والسلام, when they mention these things about all your past sins being forgiven, usually the many of the ulama interpret this as your minor sins and not major sins, because they mention that major sins require a specific repentance, and nor does this entail a forgiveness of the hukuk. This this hadith is very clear, and again, all these actions are considered recommended or sunnah in the prayer. Saying Ameen is not considered obligatory or wajib. And then Imam al-Quduri says, ثم يكبر ويركع ويعتمد بيديه على ركبتيه ويفرج أصابعه ويبسط ظهره ولا يرفع رأسه سبحان ربي العظيم ثلاثا وذلك أدناه. Then he says the takbir and bows. He places his hands on his knees and spreads his fingers and levels his back and does not raise or lower his head. And all of this is basically a description of various hadith that have come from the Prophet ﷺ regarding how he performed the ruku'. And so there are reports that the Prophet ﷺ of varying strength. Some reports mention that the Prophet ﷺ, his back would be so straight in ruku' that you could essentially sort of place or pour water on his back and it would remain still. And so that's how some of the companions described the ruku' of the Prophet ﷺ, and there are a number of hadith on this issue. We won't mention them in your own time. And then he says he recites in the bowing Subhan Rabbi al-Azim and 3 times, and this is the minimal. Now over here, if you look at what Imam al-Quduri says, he says ثُمَّ يُكَبِّرُ, right? So this takbir again is a sunnah. The only thing that is obligatory when it comes to the takbir is the opening takbir. What exactly is obligatory when it comes to the tahrima, and what exactly is necessary or wajib when it comes to the tahrima. And we mentioned that many of the ulama stated that actually saying Allahu Akbar or giving the takbir is considered a wajib of the opening invocation or of the tahrima. Subsequent takbirat in the salah are all considered sunnah. And these takbirat are basically they're done when you're moving from one integral or one position to another. And this was the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ again, where in various hadith it is mentioned that the Prophet would give takbir with every bowing and every rising. And so over here we have a hadith Allahu anhu in An-Nasa'i, in At-Tirmidhi, where this meaning is and this ruling is mentioned. And then we have the tasbihat in the ruku', and over here again we have, this is pretty well known from the Prophet ﷺ. Again, Ibn Mas'ud relates from the Prophet ﷺ that فقال في صراط فقد تم sujuduhu. Okay, over here actually I highlighted the wrong thing, but it's over here on the top bit, the first sentence, فقال في ركوعه سبحان ربي العظيم ثلاث مرات, right? That he stated in his ruku', the Prophet ﷺ, سبحان ربي العظيم 3 times, right? Advised his companions, and he said whoever says it 3 times, then basically he has completed his bowing, right? And Imam at-Tirmidhi mentions over here that the amal in the Ahl al-Ilm is upon this, right? The amal of the people of ilm is basically upon this particular hadith, namely to recite Subhana Rabbil Azim 3 times in your ruku', and this is the minimal, right? This is the minimal, they say, to realize the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. But otherwise, if you leave the tasbihat in the ruku' or even in the sujood, then this will not affect the validity of your prayer. There are some Hanafi ulama who said you can increase the number of tasbihat, keeping it a odd number, so you can go 5, 7, and even higher. But they also mention that the basis is that the imam should only recite to the extent that would not bore or make his congregation weary. And we took this legal meaning actually when it came to the mustahab times of prayer. We mentioned this idea that the law was very keen on attracting people to the congregational prayer, right? And to have an increased jama'ah or congregation. And so this is why you find various hadith from the Prophet ﷺ and instructions from the Prophet ﷺ to the imam to perform prayer in a way that keeps in mind the most weak in your congregation. And the reason for that was the Prophet ﷺ did not want people to be discouraged from joining congregation because the imam was reciting, his recitation was too long, his sujoods were too long, his ruku' was too long, etc., etc. And so this becomes a very important principle when it comes to the actions that the imam is meant to take when it comes to the congregational prayer, and that he is supposed to keep his prayer to an extent, and he should the actions that he engages in prayer in terms of his qira'ah and his tasbihat and his sujood and ruku', etc., it should be done in a way that does not turn off people from attending the congregation. And this is an explicit command from the Prophet ﷺ that he gave to his companions. And this, as we the book of prayer, such as the timings for the mustahab prayers, because one of the legal wisdoms or principles underpinning these mustahab times is what time is most conducive to a larger congregational presence. And so based on that, the Prophet ﷺ recommended specific times. Then we have ثم يرفع رأسه ويقول سمع الله لمن حمده. Then he raises his head and says سمع الله لمن حمده, and the follower replies, and what does the follower say? He says ربنا لك الحمد, and the follower replies ربنا لك الحمد. Now over here we call this the tasmi' and the tahmid. And again, we have an explicit report from the Prophet ﷺ related from Abu Hurairah radiyallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ instructs his companions that when the Imam says Sami Allah liman hamida, faqulu Allahumma rabbana lakal hamd. Right? And again, the Prophet ﷺ gives very similar, a very similar guidance in this particular hadith as he did in the hadith on Ameen, which is that if your statement Allahumma rabbana lakal hamd wafaqa, your past sins will be forgiven. Now over here there's some detail to this particular issue, and there's some khilaf between the imam and his companions. And so these are the various scenarios that we can think of when it comes to tasmi', saying Sami Allah liman hamida, and when it comes to tahmid. Okay, so Abu Hanifa over here, let's start with Abu Hanifa. So Abu Hanifa or group, or you're praying alone. So if you're praying in the group, the imam does tasmi', and the follower does tahmeed. So the Imam does not say Rabbana lakal hamd. The Imam, the only thing he says is Sami Allahu liman hamida, and then the follower says Allahumma Rabbana lakal hamd, or Rabbana lakal hamd, or any other similar form that has come in the prophetic reports or from the early Muslims. Okay, so the Imam says one thing, the follower says the other thing. And Abu Hanifa, his reasoning for this was, he was like, in the Hadith, the Prophet ﷺ makes a clear distinction between what the Imam says and what those who are following him say, and so he sticks to the very literal purport of this particular Hadith and others. And then we have a scenario where you are praying alone. Okay, so there are three basic options. Either you say both, you say Sami Allah liman hamida, and then you say Rabbana lakal hamd, right? Or you simply say Sami Allah liman hamida, or you only say Rabbana lakal hamd. And so of these three positions, or these three possibilities, saying both and saying only the tahmeed or Rabbana lakal hamd are the two more popular positions in the Hanafi school, right? Whereas this position of only saying tasmi', there were one or two Hanafi ulama who held this, but generally it was not adopted by the Hanafi ulama. Okay, now saying both returns to the idea that the one who is praying alone essentially is both an imam and a follower in a way, and there's always this there are still, you still give out a form of dhikr or messaging to unseen beings like the angels who might be present. Because when we look at tasmi', what is tasmi'? Tasmi' is basically trying to encourage people to do hamd, right? It is encouraging people to do hamd and to engage in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the argument that the people who choose this third position over here of only tahmeed, what they say is, when you're praying alone and there's no one around you, then tasmi' does not serve its purpose anymore. Because the purpose of tasmi' is to encourage your congregation to engage in hamd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so when there is no congregation, this particular function of tasmi' ceases to be. Alone should only do tahmeed, or should only say Rabbana lakal hamd. And this was a position that was sorry, one second. This was a position that was chosen by Imam al-Halwani, Imam al-Sarakhsi, Imam al-Nasafi, Imam al-Mawsili, and many other leading ulama. That you say both is the riwayah of Al-Hasan ibn Ziyad from Abi Hanifa, and it was also chosen by a number of leading ulama such as Imam al-Marghinani and al-Murtashi and others. It seems like the position of only tahmeed is the more dominant position in the school. Okay, it is the more dominant position in the school. But both the position of saying only the tahmeed are valid and sound positions in the school, and they both have their own logic to them. Sorry, let me just. Now continuing over here, we're going to get into a really complex discussion. So if you're a little, groggy right now, or it's time to wake up a little bit at this moment, if you're interested in this specific discussion, because it's a little complex. So Imam al-Quduri then says, فإذا استوى قائما كبر وسجد واعتمد بيديه على الأرض. Right, that when he stands up, he says the takbir and prostrates. ووضع وجهه بين كفيه وسجد على أنفه وجبهته. He places his hands on the ground and his face between his two palms. And again, there are various descriptions that have come regarding the Prophet ﷺ performing prostration in this way. And then he says, فَإِنِ اقْتَصَرَ عَلَى أَحَدِهِمَا جاز عند أبي حنيفة وقال أبو يوسف ومحمد لا يجوز الاقتصار على الأنف إلا من عذر. That if he prostrates on his nose and forehead, but if he only does sajda on one of them, it is permitted with Abu Hanifa. And we took the details of this in the previous lessons. Whereas Abu Yusuf and Muhammad said it is not permitted to only prostrate on the nose unless there is an excuse. And if he prostrates on the fold of his turban or on the extra portion of his clothing, it is permitted. If he prostrates on the fold of his turban or on the extra portion of his clothing, then this is also permitted. Now over here, there is an interesting discussion, which is standing after bowing. So what does Imam Quduri mention? He mentions the ruku', he mentions what you say in ruku', then he says, فَإِذَا اسْتَوَى قَائِمًا كَبَّرَ, right? And so he's mentioning that you stand up after the ruku'. So what's the hukm, or what's the ruling of this particular stand, right? And the standing after bowing before going into prostration. There are two opinions that are ascribed to Abu Hanifa and Muhammad. One is that it is wajib, that this standing after you perform the ruku' is considered wajib. The other position is that it is a sunnah, right? That it is a sunnah, that it is not wajib for an individual to stand after he has performed the ruku'. Okay, and each of these positions have their dalil. It seems like I haven't been able to conclude on a personal level which position seems or is sounder. Of course, various ulama have their tarjihat or their preferences, but looking into this issue, I still need to do more research into which of these specific positions is sounder. It certainly seems to me that many of the earlier ulama went with the position that it is only a sunnah, even a high level of the sunnah, a confirmed sunnah or an emphasized sunnah, whereas many later ulama deemed it to be wajib or necessary. That's the general gist that I have gotten right now, but both these opinions exist, and both of these opinions are sound opinions in the Hanafi school, and we'll get to the legal reasoning behind them. Abu Yusuf, on the other hand, said this standing after bowing is obligatory. It is fard. It is an actual fard, right? And over here, we have another issue, which is raising the head after bowing. Okay, and so they're distinct. So one is, okay, do you have to stand after the bowing? Okay, that's one issue, which we discussed over here. And we mentioned Abu Yusuf has an opinion, which is that it is fard. And Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, there's some disagreement on whether the position that is to be ascribed to them is of wujub, or is it that it is sunnah. This is regarding the standing after bowing. Then we have rising the head after bowing. So over here, the issue is not standing after bowing. The issue is, okay, do you at least have to lift your head up a little bit after the bowing and before you go into prostration? Now, there are two opinions from Abu Hanifa related to this issue. Abu Yusuf, of course, it's obligatory with him, because if it's obligatory to stand with him, then a fortiori, it's obligatory to raise the head, right? Because standing involves raising the head. So that's why we don't mention Abu Yusuf over here, because his position is obvious. Abu Hanifa, there are two opinions ascribed to him on this issue. One is that raising of the head after bowing is considered obligatory. A second position is that raising the head after bowing is not considered obligatory. And this is the sounder position. And it is the position that also accords with the view of Muhammad. And so essentially, whether it's raising the head after bowing or fully standing after bowing or properly standing after bowing, both Abu Hanifa and Muhammad do not deem this to be obligatory. And what that means is you can actually simply, from your ruku', you can go straight into your sajda without contravening a fard of your prayer, right? And without thus invalidating your prayer. And so there's no need in the Hanafi school, there's no obligation to raise your head or stand up after the ruku' and before the sujood. And so what's the legal reasoning of these ulama? So let's look at the reasoning of Abu Yusuf first. Abu Yusuf's reasoning is this hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, right? And in this particular hadith, we've highlighted three main parts, one in red, one in blue, and one in purple. And so in this hadith, a rough summary of this hadith is that a man entered the masjid and he prayed in the masjid while the Prophet ﷺ was present. And so when he finished his prayer, the Prophet ﷺ said, go back, right? Go back to your place and repeat your prayer because you have not prayed. And so the man did this again. He went and he prayed. And when he finished his prayer, the Prophet ﷺ said the same thing to him, right? On the third instance, this person asked the Prophet ﷺ that, okay, teach me how I should be praying then. And so the Prophet ﷺ told him that, when you stand up to pray, then perform the wudu, face the qibla, do the takbir, recite what is easy for you from the Quran, then perform the ruku' hatta tatma'inna raki'an, and then what? And then he says over here, this purple part, ثم ارفع رأسك حتى تعتدل قائما. Then lift your head up until you are standing upright. And so over here, Abu Yusuf looks at this hadith, and what he says is that, okay, this hadith is telling us three things. One, the Prophet is commanding this individual to repeat the prayer. Second, the Prophet is describing this person's prayer as essentially a non-prayer. The Prophet is telling him, فَإِنَّكَ لَمْ تُصَلِّ, that you have not prayed. And then thirdly, the Prophet is commanding him to perform certain actions in all of his prayers. And one of those actions is what? إِرْفَعْ رَأْسَكَ حَتَّى تَعْتَدِلْ قَائِمًا, that you should stand up after performing the bowing. And so Abu Yusuf uses this particular hadith to argue that standing up after bowing, standing up after the ruku' is considered obligatory, because the Prophet ﷺ, when he was describing what is a prayer and what isn't a prayer, commanded this individual to stand up after his bowing. And that indicates to us that this is a obligatory component of the prayer. So this is the reasoning of Abu Yusuf. What is the reasoning of Abu Hanifa and Muhammad? Right? What is the reasoning of Abu Hanifa and Muhammad? Both of them say that it is not obligatory, right? And this again returns to many of the points that we've already mentioned in previous lessons regarding this core idea of Hanafi epistemology, where we have specific notions of what is decisive, what is probabilistic, and we have a weighing of the evidence in a way where texts that are of a higher epistemological standing are given preference to those of a lower epistemological standing, and the lower does not condition the higher. So again, Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, their reasoning is, okay, standing has nothing to do, bowing and prostration, right, has nothing to do with ruku' and sujood. There's no intrinsic essential link between standing and between ruku' or sujood, right? The Quran has unconditionally commanded us to perform ruku' and to perform sujood. We know the meaning of ruku' and sujood in the Arabic language. And this standing in between ruku' and sujood does not fall into that meaning, right? And this particular hadith that you've mentioned is a singular hadith. It does not reach the rutbah or the level of the Quran in its in the decisiveness of its establishment, and so we are not going to condition the Quran which only commands ruku' and sujood with this particular hadith. So that's the first line, and we've mentioned various details regarding this line of argument in previous lessons as well. So you can go back to those lessons for details. The second thing that Abu Hanifa and Muhammad address is, does the standing take the same ruling as the first standing? So qiyam, we know qiyam is an integral of prayer. Does this standing between the ruku' and sujood, does this count as almost a continuation of that original rukn of standing? Abu Hanifa and Muhammad say no, it doesn't, right? It doesn't, because the asl, the basis is that the arkan of salah, firstly, do not repeat. Qiyam does not repeat, ruku' does not repeat, qira'ah does not repeat within a single cycle. The only thing that's an exception to this rule is the sujood. But otherwise, none of the arkan of salah repeat. Okay, so this is the basis. And so what Abu Hanifa and Muhammad say is that the function of this standing between ruku' and sujood, right, is to allow an individual to move from one action to another, to move from one integral, from one rukn, which is the ruku' over here, to another rukn, which is the sujood. So this particular standing is actually not maqsood in itself. It is not something that is sought in and of itself. Rather, it is a wasila, or a means to realize sujood after performing the ruku'. But Abu Hanifa and Muhammad say, okay, if you don't do the standing after ruku' and you go straight down into sajda, you are still fulfilling the meaning of sajda, because sajda is simply placing your forehead or part of your face on the earth. And you don't require a qiyam, you don't require to realize that meaning of sajda, right? And so they argue from this perspective as well, that the standing does not take the hukm of a rukn. It is a means simply to realize sujood, and sujood can actually, the meaning of sajda that the Quran commands us to perform within prayer can actually be realized without this particular standing after the ruku'. And so these are some of the arguments that Abu Hanifa and Muhammad mentioned regarding this point. And so based on that, again, they looked at this hadith and they said that, well, this hadith cannot condition the Quranic verse. And so how are we going to interpret it? We're going to interpret it in various ways. Firstly, what we see is they said that this idea of the command to repeat the prayer, right? The command to repeat the prayer does not necessarily mean that your prayer is completely invalid, because you repeat your prayer to make up for any naqs or deficiency that you've had in your prayer. This is true even in the Hanafi school, where if you leave out a wajib action intentionally, right, within a prayer, it is wajib upon you to repeat that prayer within the time. And some ulama said even after the time, right? And so repetition of a prayer does not necessarily correlate with the invalidity of a prayer. And the Hanafi say one evidence of this is that the Prophet ﷺ actually let this individual complete his prayer. You know, he let this individual complete his prayer rather than stopping him midway and telling him, hey, you know, what you're doing right now is completely invalid. You know, if this person's prayer was completely invalid, then the Prophet ﷺ would not have allowed him to continue performing this whole routine without intervening. Rather, he only intervened when he finished the prayer because he saw a naqs or a deficiency in it, and he taught him how to rectify that specific deficiency. And then that there are some reports from the Prophet ﷺ that mention in this regard when it comes to not invalidity, but the prayer being deficient, that there's a naqs in the prayer. And the Prophet ﷺ ends by telling the audience that whoever does not perform these actions that I've described, then he has done a naqs of his prayer. So the Prophet is still describing the action of the person as a prayer, but one that is deficient. And then this idea of commanding to perform certain actions in all prayers, again, this command, according to Abu Hanifa and Muhammad, needs to be understood in light of the Quranic command, which does not mention raising the head after bowing to be an integral or a fard of the prayer. And nor does the meaning of ruku' and sujood require this particular standing in order for them to be fulfilled. And so what we are going to do, they still act upon this hadith. They say what we are going to do is we are going to deem this standing after bowing either to be a sunnah or to be wajib. Right? And some ulama, as you mentioned, considered it to be wajib. Other ulama considered it to be a sunnah. And those who considered it to be wajib did so based on this very hadith. Right? Because they said that this hadith commands us to raise our heads after bowing and stand up. And this was the continual practice of the Prophet ﷺ. And so we are going to assign the ruling of wujub to this, but not the ruling of obligation. Right? Not the ruling of obligation, because the Quran is clear on what the minimal obligation is, and standing after the bowing is not mentioned or indicated in the Quran. And this same reasoning basically applies to this idea that we took, raising the head after bowing. Right? Why did Abu Hanifa, why is there a report from Abu Hanifa saying that a principle that al-intiqal min rukn ila rukn is fard? That, and this is almost, I mean, this is an obvious fact. This is something that we obviously recognize, that moving from one integral to another is considered an obligation. So anything that is required to move from one integral to negation, right? But in this case, again, standing is not required to move from a state of ruku' to a state of sujood, to move from the integral of ruku' to the integral of sujood. You can just go straight from ruku' into sujood and you fulfill the meaning of both, right? Without that middle standing or without having to raise your head. And so even though this principle of Abu Hanifa is sound and we accept it, still it does not justify deeming raising the head after bowing or standing after bowing to be obligatory. But we can say that it is necessary or wajib or is sunnah. Then we have this issue that Imam Quduri mentioned about he prostrate on the fold of his turban or on the extra portion of limited. So over here, this is a pretty straightforward issue. The legal rationale of this is that this is basically no different to prostrating on any other cloth or mat or a prayer mat, because it does not prevent the meaning of sujood from being realized. And this connects to the topic governing principle. The topic governing principle is basically that principle that we took for the minimal obligation for sujood, right? To which the word sajda applies. It's as simple as that. So this legal rationale connects back to that topic governing principle. It explains to us why this ruling is the way it is. And it is because, well, this is still fulfilling the meaning of prostration. The only condition the ulama mention is that whatever you're placing your head upon, you should be able to place your, feel the pressure of the ground. And so, if you're trying to do sujood on like a stack of, fluffy pillows, then that will not count as a valid sajda. But on, some cloth or a prayer mat or the fold of your turban, then that is considered valid and acceptable. Even though some of the ulama say that it is disliked without an excuse. It is disliked without an excuse. Then Imam al-Quduri describes the sujood of the Prophet ﷺ. And he says that he the individual widens his armpits, right? وَيُجَافِي بَطْنَهُ عَنْ فَخِذَيْهِ وَيُوَجِّهُ أَصَابِعَ رِجْلِهِ, that he widens his armpit, separates his stomach from his thighs, points the fingers of his toes towards the Qibla. وَيَقُولُ فِي سُجُودِهِ سُبْحَانَ رَبِّيَ الْأَعْلَى ثَلَاثًا وَذَلِكَ أَدْنَاهُ. He says in his prostration, Subhana Rabbil A'la, 3 times, and this is the minimal. Now, this particular form of sitting that he has described is, of course, a sunnah for men. And there are various hadith that I've mentioned on the side over here that describe the prostration of the Prophet ﷺ, and his instruction again to his companions. And so the Prophet in Bukhari and Muslim told his companions, يَعْتَضِلُوا فِي السُّجُودِ, right, that be straight in prostration. وَلَا يَبْسُطُ أَحَدُكُمْ إِذْرَاعَيْهِ إِنْبِسَاطِ الْقَلْبِ, right, be straight in your prostration and let none of you put his forearms on the ground like a dog. And some of the companions describing the sujood of the Prophet said that when the Prophet إِذَا سَجَدَ فَرَّجَ يَدَيْهِ عَنْ إِبْطَيْهِ, that he would separate his hands from his armpits until we would be able to see the whiteness of his noble armpits. And both of these reports that we mentioned are related by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. This, of course, form of sitting does not apply to women. Rather, a female should do sajda with her limbs more closely aligned, or not separated and widened out like the recommendation is for men. And this again returns to the topic governing principle that we mentioned in the last class, which is that the prayer of a woman is based upon what is more concealing and what is more modest. And so in this case, this is why her sajda takes on a different ruling to that of men. يرفع رأسه ويكبر فإذا اطمأن جالسا كبر وسجد. Then he raises his head and says the takbir. When he settles in a seating position, he says the takbir and prostrates a second time. فإذا اطمأن ساجدا كبر واستوى قائما على صدور قدميه ولا يقعد. When he settles in prostration, he says the takbir and stands up straight on his feet without sitting and without place. ولا يعتمد بيديه على الأرض. Right? He does not place his hands on the ground. Rather, he goes straight from a position of prostration to the standing position. Now over here, we have 3 basic discussions again. 3 complex discussions regarding prostration. So Imam al-Quduri, what does he mention? When you perform the first sajda, what do you do after that? ثم يرفع رأسه ويكبر فإذا اطمأن جالسا كبر وسجد. So you actually sit up, right? You settle in that seating position. Then you say the takbir again and you prostrate for a second time. So we have 3 discussions over here. First, we have rising from prostration. Then we have sitting between prostrations. And then we have this idea of stillness or being settled in this position of. So here, rising from prostration. We have 2 views in the school regarding what is the minimal you have to rise from in order to validly enter into your second prostration. Okay? Some ulama, some leading ulama like Imam al-Quduri, Imam al-Saraqsi, said that it is sufficient, the rising from prostration that is obligatory on an individual, the rising from a first prostration to go into a second prostration, the minimal required is a rising that removes your forehead and nose from the ground. Why? Because this returns to the idea that we took when it came to rising from ruku'. Rising from ruku', we took that for Abu Hanifa, intiqal from one rukun, from one integral, moving from one integral to another, from one fard action to another is considered fard. And again, this is an obvious point. Moving from ruku' to sujood is fard, right? Because there's no other way you can fulfill sujood without moving a prostration. So this is, pretty obvious. But unlike ruku', in ruku', the standing after the ruku' is not required to move into a position of sajda, because sajda is simply placing the face or the forehead on the ground. You can simply go from ruku' straight into the position of sajda, and that meaning is fulfilled. Between two prostrations, there needs to be at least a minimal removal of the head from the ground in order to place it back on the ground and realize the meaning of sajda for your second prostration. You cannot just keep your head on the ground and say, oh, I've performed 2 sajdas. Right? It doesn't work like that. So there needs to be some rising from prostration in order for intiqal from the first sajda to the second sajda, in order for there to be a change or a movement from one prostration to the second prostration that is required in that cycle, right? And so al-Quduri, al-Sarakhsi, Imam al-Mawsili, and others said, well, okay, as long as you just lift your head up a little bit and then put it back down, that's sufficient. Because again, you fulfill the meaning of that second, place your head on the ground, right? So you're in your first sajda, you lift your head slightly, you put it back, you fulfill your second sajda. The ma'na or the meaning of sajda has been fulfilled. So this is their argument. Imam al-Marghinani, however, what he says, and others, is that no, you have to rise from the sujood in a way where you are closer to sitting than to prostration. And one of the ways Imam al-Marghinani describes this is that someone who's looking at you should be able to say, oh, that person is not prostrating. That person is now sitting. Okay, so over here, what we have essentially, basically, is both these groups of ulama recognize that this rising from prostration is needed in order to realize in sajda after the first one. They recognize this. And so this rising from prostration, they say, is obligatory. But then they differ on the extent, the minimal extent of this rising. Okay, now over here, what we see again is this tension between legal meanings. And we've seen this tension before in previous issues as well. We've seen this tension in previous issues as well. And so there are these various principles that are in conflict with each other. Imam al-Quduri, Imam al-Sarakhsi, Imam al-Mawsili, and others are going by this rule that al-hukmu yata'allaku bi-adna ma yatanawaluhu al-ism. That the hukm, that a legal rule, right, it's ta'alluq. What is it related to? What does it relate to? It relates to the minimal basically the minimal is indicated or affirmed by a particular expression. So when it comes to sajda, we took this issue before. When it comes to sajda, there were Hanafis who said that sajda is simply placing the head on the ground. That's it. As long as that meaning is fulfilled, then your sajda is valid. You've performed a valid sajda. They said the same thing when it came to recitation. Recitation simply means, to say words, whether audibly or with the movement of your tongue. And when we want to add recitation in the Quran simply means this one verse. That's it, nothing more. And so these ulama were going by this principle, that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses an expression, the hukam that attaches itself to the meets the definition of that expression. So whether it's sajda, ruku', qira'ah, etc., etc. So based on that, they're saying that a minimal over here, rising from prostration, suffices, because that is all that is needed in order to state that you have now lifted your head and you are placing your head back on the ground for a second sajda. However, they actually agree with this principle in one way, but they add this condition that ما يتناوله الاسم في العرف والعادة, that what a particular expression, the meaning that it conveys customarily. And we took this idea of customarily before when it came to the Sahibain and Qira'ah. Right, the Sahibain, the reason they didn't on one Quranic verse being sufficient for the fard Qira'ah or the fard recitation in prayer is because they say that no, we need to look at who is considered a reciter of the Quran customarily. You know, what do we customarily assign as minimally Quran and recitation of the Quran? And so over here, Imam al-Marghinani is actually working off principle that, well, yes, you've risen a little bit from prostration, but people in their customary understanding still view you as being in prostration. If all you've done is lift your head up 2 centimeters off the ground after your first sajda, fil urfi wal adati, this you're still viewed as being in sajda. The only time you're viewed as actually having come out of your first sajda is when you are closer to sitting than to prostration. And other principles also apply to this. There's this principle that the second, this middle principle over here on the right side, that when a thing draws closer to something else, then it takes on its hukum. When something draws closer to something else, it takes on its hukum. So when you're rising from prospectively seen as in a state or in the position of prostration until you reach a point where you become closer to the sitting than you do to the actual prostrating position. And so there are